So these are kind of some things that I'm going to talk about, and we can spend more or less time on any of the sections depending on what you guys want to talk about or what we want to delve deep into. I'm going to start out sort of talking about dystopias and where they sit in futures thinking and kind of why they capture the imagination, and then go into how I've used them and others' futures tools in work with government, in building community futures, and in my current role right now working primarily with businesses. So I'll start with kind of the big picture of dystopias, and sort of ask you guys, does everyone know what a dystopia is? Like, everyone's kind of clear as to what that is? No?
Our current political climate?
Well, that's great, actually, because a lot of people think of dystopias as like these future states or these like fictional worlds, but they could be happening right now. It's basically just like a bad society or a scary society, and it doesn't have to necessarily be in the future. And it's also very subjective. So, you know, like you could live in The Handmaid's Tale and be one of the men who has a wife and a handmaid, and you're loving life. You know, it's like not a dystopia for you. It's just like an awesome world. Or you could live in that world and think, you know, that it's a surveillance state and it's really oppressive, and you're denied human rights, and then it becomes a dystopia for you. So basically, when we think about dystopias, they're usually characterized with like something bad. So fascist leadership, or disaster, or resource scarcity, or some sort of like large theme that's created the bad thing that then permeates society and that society has restructured itself around. Trump's election, you know, perhaps. I think that one of the reasons that we like them is it does make us think that stuff we're doing today could potentially be adding to that dystopia. Like if you think of a lot of the issues, like there's these giant plastic gyres in the Pacific Ocean that are these huge spirals of discarded plastics that have found their way into the ocean. And then you think like, that's really horrible and crazy that, you know, there's all of this plastic that ends up in the waste stream, that plastic ends up in the ocean, to just make like a sea of plastic. So then it's not that hard to think, well, what am I doing that's contributing to the sea of plastic? And if the sea of plastic just continues on for another 20 years, what's that going to look like? And kind of so on and so forth. And like I kind of just want to hit on this theme that dystopias are really popular, really, really popular. And they're actually seeing a resurgence. So the amount of dystopian fiction that's being put out has increased, especially in young adult fiction, which is mildly disturbing that preteens and teens like really want to read about the apocalypse. And yeah, so, you know, like dystopias, they like come up again and again. To me, Blade Runner is kind of the quintessential, like this is what the future looks like. It's really stark and brutal and harsh, and there's a lot of metal. And then like, I think what I like about the Hunger Games and like why I find it so compelling is that it's just very like, they're in nature a lot of the time. And they're sort of the arena that they build for these children to fight in is like this very like natural setting, but it's completely artificial, but it's made to look like they're kind of in a forest and stuff like that. So it's very interesting what people use to kind of fill out what the world looks like in these various dystopias. I think also that one of the common themes that kind of comes out to me in these visions is there's always this sort of message of like, the people of the future are going to band together and they're going to somehow overcome these obstacles presented by this dystopia. So like in all of these examples and in others, it's like they're finding like a way to work together cooperatively to solve these, you know, terrible things like the dehumanizing of the clones through the replicants in Blade Runner. They're going to band together and solve that. But the reason that they're in this situation in the first place is because like we, the like asshole people of the present, created this horrible world, and then they now have to somehow solve the problem. of the dystopia. So that's kind of like the dystopian narrative. And I think it's really interesting because it's very like a stripped down world. You know, you don't have all of the like different complexities of the world today. I was like talking to friends who were really big Game of Thrones fans. They were telling me about like the political intrigue of Westeros, but then like don't know anything about the political intrigue of the Senate. Because that's really complicated and there's so many moving parts, whereas Westeros is this like contained world and you can understand it, and you know, you can read a few books and kind of get a handle on what makes that world tick, versus feeling kind of like helpless and afloat in the sea of information in the world of today. So definitely it also points to present-day solutions that you can like pull out of these dystopias and see. So one of these that I really like is this is from Snowpiercer, where there's a scene in which this character is eating a protein bar that's made out of crickets or insects that are pounded together. And it's like presented as this horrible, disgusting thing, like, oh, this is so sad that we have to feed people, these poor people, these insect bars. And you know, like now, currently, you can go to Whole Foods and buy these insect bars, and they're a premium, like delicious product. So it's kind of looking at, there are also like these weird themes that come up in dystopias. Soylent is another example where like there's no protein in that world, so they're eating human beings as protein, and now there's a product that you can buy that's like a meal replacement that's called Soylent. So I feel like these kind of dystopian worlds definitely do impact products that are created and the way people kind of think about the future. And I also think that, you know, while it's interesting, it's really hard. Like, this is a really rare example. It's kind of hard to use dystopian fiction to just, on its own, get people to do anything. Because, again, people sort of see it as like, well, I'm just in this very confusing present, and these like future people will band together and they'll solve these problems. You know, I don't need to really do anything. Like, you know, Blade Runner is great. I don't know how many people saw Blade Runner and thought, like, I really need to do something about climate change, or, you know, like, cloning is wrong, or whatever, like bioengineering. I don't know how many people took that away. It was like a very lovely, entertaining experience, and it made you think about your role in humanity, but then, you know, you kind of just leave and you're like, okay, done. So how can these sorts of like really compelling visions that grab people in terms of entertainment be used also for kind of practical purposes to get people to do something and to actually change the way they're living and change the way they're doing business? So that's kind of going to be the focus of my talk. And I want to talk a little bit about, to take a step back and say that these dystopian visions kind of exist within this larger field of futures. So there's kind of the dystopia for entertainment and fiction and speculative fiction, and then there's sort of this larger field of study called future studies, and they sort of Venn diagram each other. So future studies, and I think most of you have not taken a future studies class yet. Okay, so future studies is the short description is kind of this whole field of thought and study of looking at tools to study the future, make it more manageable, and then work to take actions to create the future that you want. So if you have a vision of the future that you want that is desired, and as well as a vision that you don't want, what are practical steps that you can take today to ensure that those things happen? So like, I think a good quote I heard was that the future, your vision of the future is made up of what you prioritize. So things that you find important will impact that vision for better, for worse in the future. So this is kind of one example of a futures tool, which is kind of signals of change, watching trends. So there's kind of scenarios and future scenarios, which is sort of creating these fake worlds or speculative worlds in which you imagine these different futures. And then there's looking at trends, there's looking at horizon scanning, there's a whole number of kind of futures tools that people like me use when working with groups on how to achieve a preferred future and avoid an undesirable future. I'm not going to go into all of them. That would take a much longer time. So I want to talk a little bit about kind of using those sort of futures tools and how to use these sort of dystopias as worst case scenarios. And the first kind of segment of how I want to talk about that is looking at how it would be applied to working with the government. And before I kind of delve into that, ooh, really fuzzy, I will give you a little bit about like kind of how I got there, so you're not thinking like, okay, great, futures tools, how did she start working with futures and the government? That's confusing. So I did my undergraduate at Carnegie Mellon, proud CMU grad. And I think one of the things that Carnegie Mellon's really good for is interdisciplinary work, which is kind of big now, but I think in 2001, when I started going to college, was not that big of a deal. And it's sort of kind of grown and flourished. But Carnegie Mellon was definitely, at that point, also a hotbed of interdisciplinary studies. So I studied material science in the School of Engineering and anthropology in the School of Humanities. And I think my goal was to be an archaeologist. So I really liked material culture. And I was like, oh, this is great. I'm going to study X-ray diffraction and be able to date things. And then I'm also going to study these objects and culture and how people use them. That did not really happen for me. And I ended up kind of veering into more pure anthropology and looking sort of at cultures as systems. And I thought that was really compelling to look at kind of like what makes a culture work? How does it tick? And after doing that, I did a Fulbright in India. And I spent a year kind of looking at the Indian hair industry, the human hair industry. And one of my colleagues who I worked on that with ended up working with Chris Rock on a documentary about it. But that was kind of like, I was still kind of like, all right, yeah, this is really interesting. Culture and how cultures use objects, and what does this human hair as just like what does it mean? You know, like what does it symbolize to the person who's giving it up, and what does it symbolize to the person who's getting it? So I did a little bit of that, and then I went to Georgetown to do a master's in foreign service with a focus on international development. So I kind of wanted to go more on the kind of development side of things and see if I could have an impact. And after doing that, I found myself in 2009 in midst of a global recession. So that was great. So I had all of these I'm like, yeah, I love anthropology and development. I really want to help people. But that was not meant to be at that point in my life. So I had these other interests in kind of gaming and theater. So I was really interested in role-playing games and theater, and sort of looking at, I was sharing with Elliot, I'm really into fictional maps. And so I'm really into creating kind of fictional maps and boards. And so I was like, all right, I have all of these interests, but I really need a job. What can I do with this foreign policy degree? And I ended up getting a job as a government contractor working in intelligence and security, working for the DoD and the CIA and all sorts of government intelligence agencies in Washington. So I started out kind of thinking like, all right, well, I don't know how exciting this will be, but it turns out it's actually pretty interesting. The US government spends a lot of time and a lot of money thinking about the future. And that should sort of make sense because they think about it in terms of risk. And for them, dystopias are very important because they want to know the worst case scenario for everything, for terrorism, for bioterrorism, for small political events happening around the world, things like the Arab Spring. What does that mean for the government and how it's going to respond? And a lot of what our intelligence community does is risk preparedness and readiness. So kind of knowing what different scenarios and outcomes could be and then preparing themselves to handle those risks. So this is a publicly, accessible report put out by the National Intelligence Council that I would like to think that I worked on, but I can't say for sure because everything is classified, called Global Trends 2030. And this is from 2012. They put one out every 5 years, looking at large kind of political trends happening around the world, and then speculating on different worlds that could happen and what would be desired by them. How would the US respond in those different worlds? So, you can just Google this and read it. It's pretty interesting. And then I just wanted to share kind of like what they consider the dystopian world. And in the report, they specifically say this is the most plausible worst case scenario. So there's always like the even more worse that you can go, like the zombie attack scenario, or aliens invading scenario. But this is like practically speaking for them what is the worst case scenario, which is globalization stalling out and the US economy and as well as global growth sort of like leveling. So instead of growth going up, up, and up, it's just sort of flat, and a political conflict climate around the world. There's more conflict, it's more unstable, and the US becomes really insular. So I would say some might argue that parts of this are happening today, but this is sort of the bad situation, US leadership, and then these are kind of factors that they looked at to think about what would bring that about. So what are like the things that are happening? Weak US leadership, a crisis-prone global economy that can't recover from risk very easily, and fluctuation, and then increased instability. So basically conflicts happening around the world, like terrorist conflicts that prevent trade and commerce and cause countries to just focus inward. So, I would say like Brexit, probably an indicator there as well. So this is really key, and kind of a very specific way in which I was and people are applying futures and this sort of worst case scenario visioning to a very specific, to get a very specific outcome. And then of course, war games is a major part of that. So it was a good thing that I really liked games when I started this job, because war games were a major part of that work. And the military spends a lot of time, as well as government officials spend a lot of time just going through war games. And these can be many people in a hotel holed up for a week going through some sort of climate change scenario in which China's doing this and India's doing that. It could be a video game. It could be, I think this is something that's being used with like maps, some sort of map army game. But that is a big way in which they sort of prepare and engage tangibly with those worlds. So the first thing that I showed you was a report, that report sent out, and then the games kind of make it real for people so that they can engage with it. Unfortunately, it's not publicly available. I have a friend who is still there at the consulting firm, and he has been there for 10 years, and he's like, I can never get another job now because I'll never be able to tell anyone what I did. So, fun. So I did that for a few years, and then I kind of got tired of doing terrorism in the world 2040. It was not very heartwarming to kind of like live in this dystopia space forever. So I took a break and wanted to do something that was more related to international development and was more focused on engaging with people. So I ended up taking a fellowship in Hawaii, beautiful Hawaii. And so I went to Hawaii on a fellowship and was just kind of there, like in between careers, trying to figure out what I was gonna do with myself. And I encountered a lot of people there who actually do this sort of futures and scenario work from a more theoretical standpoint. So Hawaii has, so this is us doing a little bit of like personal futures, which is also a field within futures where you can like plan out your life for the next 5 years, or think about all of your personal goals and how to reach them. So I learned about the Manoa School of Futures. So there's actually a lot of work being done. I would say the Manoa School and Houston are kind of the two big foresight schools in the US, but there's many more programs available. And I did not attend this program, so I can't speak to it, but I was an academic hanger-on of this program. So it was on a separate fellowship, but I just attended their stuff and lingered around them enough to understand their methodology a little bit. And one of the kind of hallmarks of the Manoa School of Futures is to use archetypes. So instead of using a 2x2 matrix to create a scenario in which you take a variable x and a variable y and then basically make a matrix and then create 4 scenarios out of those variables, the Manoa School is saying that there's 4 kind of main archetypes that you can look at. Continuation, which is just like more of the status quo. Limits and disciplines, so like a more kind of disciplined society. Decline and collapse, and transformation. So if you were to look at this like a climate change scenario very, very roughly with these sort of archetypes, you could say like continuation is like we basically don't do anything about climate change. We just keep on going the way we're going. Discipline is like kind of more laws and regulations to have us curb consumption. Collapse would be, maybe if this continued, like we just like use up all the gas and pollute the world as much as we want, and then there's a global collapse of resources and ecosystems, and then we have to deal with that when it happens. And then transformation, which is sort of like the tech solution, where like, oh, technology will come and that will enable us to use renewable energy and aquaculture, whatever. So in this, there is a distinct dystopian world, which is the collapse world, in which many of the systems that we currently know have collapsed. And that's generally considered a bad thing, although some people write and create these archetypes so that collapse can be seen as positive, depending on your values. So before I go into the next thing, any questions so far about anything? Okay, so I was there on my fellowship, and I got this cool opportunity to go to Myanmar, Burma, and essentially the entity that was funding my fellowship was like, hey, if you want to stay around, we really need you to do something for us in Myanmar. So we have this issue. This is the problem that we have. We have this huge alumni network there. We somehow need to tap into them. The time is now to do something because Myanmar has, I don't know how many people are familiar with Myanmar. Right now, a lot of bad things are happening there, but back in 2013, it was like just opening up to the outside. They were just about to have their elections. They were just about to have freedom of the press, and a number of things there. Had been a very closed society for a long time. So it was just opening up to the outside world, and they wanted, the East-West Center as an academic entity wanted to go and engage with the alumni network, provide value, and help in terms of presenting like a positive shared vision of the future of the country. So they're like, do something about this. So that's sort of a tall order, but I ended up working with John Sweeney at the Manoa School of Futures, as well as a number of other people, to put on this event called the Myanmar Futures Exchange, which was kind of like a 2-day conference in which we invited religious leaders and NGO workers and government officials, business leaders, just anyone and everyone who was interested to come together and talk about the future of the country. And so we created a number of like fun materials for this. So these are our postcards from the future, and I'm sorry I don't have a better image, but we created nifty like postcards from the future of Myanmar. So this is sort of like one of the famous pagodas, and this is a backdrop of like skyscrapers, which do not exist currently. So this is kind of like about urban development. This is about the capital city, Naypyidaw, where nobody wants to go because it's a fake created city in the middle of the country, being like cool and having a lot of traffic. Schools having iPads, which was like totally unheard of, and this is a refugee camp. So this is Bhagat, which is like a famous tourist site, famous for many pagodas. And so what would it look like if there was climate change and we had to turn that plane that it's on into a refugee camp? So we sort of like started to create things that we thought would engage people, both in terms of tangible artifacts, in addition to process. And I am more on the process side of things, so it was more, how can we create 2 days worth of content to help people achieve these goals of talking with one another, feeling free to talk about things, thinking kind of big picture and strategically and outside of their specific interest, and then providing kind of tangible recommendations that could go forward to the government officials that were there, as well as they could take back to their own organizations. So the way, like the abridged version of that process was creating a lot of these factor cards. So we created different ones based on the issues that were happening in Myanmar, on things like democratic gridlock or human capital, migration, things that we saw could either be positive or negative. Depending on how they went in the future, they could have both either a positive or negative impact. And we had people kind of prioritize these and think about which they see as like the biggest risks and the biggest opportunities. We had artists on hand who did a lot of illustration of some of the factors that we thought that the group thought were really interesting. So these were art students who would then do kind of like local illustrations on the different factors that we were talking about in terms of like the future. I thought these were particularly cute. And then we had people do a lot of kind of mapping, and we created like a gallery of everybody's scenarios. So these are really simple scenarios where they created like a 2x2 matrix based on variables. They could express themselves either in their native language, they could express themselves in English, they could just draw pictures if they wanted to. We just left it open for people to express themselves however they felt comfortable. So there's a lot, like this one is just all art. So I can't really interpret it, but this is like their negative scenarios, like in this corner where they have a lack of resources and increasing unemployment, and those are sort of what they see as characterizing like a negative future for them. And then finally, we tried to do a lot of action planning. So taking those variables and the top 3 variables, like what could actually practically be done by the people and the organizations present in the room. So trying to like take these visions of the future and the things that had been discussed and move them into the action space and find ways of holding people accountable to those actions. And this is another image, but it's kind of, it was really interesting for me to see the use of futures techniques in terms of like big picture, big participatory development projects. And there's a lot of this work going on. John, who I worked with on this, now works for the UNDP, where they do games and things like that. And what I found in Myanmar, because there were so many cultural issues of like older people should get to talk first, or men should be talking before women. Because of all of those cultural issues, talking about the present is sometimes very fraught and political, whereas talking about this like speculative future is something everybody can get on board with. So the future almost is like this tool for us to just talk about the actual problems today, because anything that we talk about in the future is based on things that we are facing today. So that's kind of like what was unsaid in this workshop, but I think people kind of got it, and that was why they were so eager to embrace the futures thinking. They weren't like, oh yeah, let's just like waste 2 days creating, fictional worlds to live in. They were like, oh, okay, well, we can talk about some of our issues, and who doesn't want to be part of creating this like positive shared shared image for our country. And that was also really interesting to me because having spent so much time with government and these like horrible scenarios that could happen, it's like, oh, well, it's actually beneficial in many situations to not just present worst case scenarios, but present like positive visions of the future. And unlike a dystopia, say, well, we people of the present can create this future so that, you know, the people of the future are not like scrounging around for food and stuff like that. And then this was just like another example of using futures for sort of development nonprofit work. This is part of a project that I did with the National Organization for Women, where we did futures of gender-based violence. And so we created, it was at their national conference, and we just created a lot of imagery and scenarios about different futures for gender-based violence and what that means about our assumptions today. So we talked about, you know, the, like what if there was this future product of rape defense lingerie, and what assumptions are we making if we think that that should be a product? So are we saying like, oh, well, it's like having a product like that is essentially saying it's your fault if you get raped because you're not wearing this type of you know, protective gear. So challenging kind of held assumptions helps us get to then possible solutions that we may not have thought of before. I can go through this part fast. So I started working for Forum for the Future about 4.5 years ago, I think, 4 years ago. And one of the things, after kind of not wanting to permanently be like traveling around the world in a suitcase, I came upon this book, The World We Made, and it was written by the founder of Forum for the Future. And it's basically a world in which he only presents, it's a book in which he only presents really positive scenarios about the future, and it's like kind of beautifully illustrated. It has like letters from the future, from people living in the future, and blueprints of houses that could exist. And this is, I think, an image of like renewable energy powering this community with like lovely green roofs and community gathering spaces and stuff like that. So I was just kind of like, wow, this is amazing. This is a great kind of tangible thing that immerses you into this future world, but also is uplifting in that it gives you a feeling of like, oh, well, we can make this, you know, like this is something that we can do. We can take these steps, and that the future doesn't have to be so bad and so dismal. And that kind of led me to wanting to work for his organization, Forum, where I'm now at. So Forum for the Future, we're an independent nonprofit. We're now been around for 21 years with offices in New York, Mumbai, Singapore, and London. So our big office is in London. The other ones are really small, like around, I would say, 7-8 people max. And we really believe in sustainability and a sustainable future. And so futures becomes like a tool that we use to help push businesses and organizations towards achieving that sustainable future. We have a number of other tools that we also use. And then I would say that I'm on the futures team. I kind of focus primarily my work on futures, but we also do a lot of like systems thinking. We're launching a school for systems change. We have a network of businesses and organizations that kind of talk to each other about sustainability. But futures is really our kind of our like hallmark. And I'll just share with you kind of 2 projects that we've done that I've worked on in which we've used futures and future visioning. The first one is the protein challenge. And this, we kind of started with a large vision, and then we went into the solution space. So the vision was like the first framing of the project, which was, what would it look like to live in a world in which everybody has access to enough protein, and it is sustainable and good for the environment and affordable. And the reason why the focus was on protein and not just food was because we saw protein primarily being the most environmentally destructive component of food. So because a lot of protein is animal protein, that has a much bigger impact than just kind of food in general. So looking at this challenge of like, how do we, if we, in 2040, if this is the world that we want, in which like all of these things are true and people are eating more plant-based proteins and the animals we do farm are being farmed in a more ethical and environmentally friendly manner, you know, how do we get there? And then from that kind of vision, we pulled back and then started doing more of a systems process. So we did a systems map. So we mapped the current protein system today, and then we looked at kind of hotspots within the system. So where does it make sense for us to actually act? So we brought food companies together, nonprofits, experts, academics, and we talked kind of about the systems map and all of the various thousands of problems impacting the food system and the protein system, and identified these 6 areas where we think really need action right now for us to create positive change. And the one that ended up getting funded and I ended up working on is the scaling up plant protein in the developed world. So that ended up through a couple of years of like iterating and coming up with ideas and workshopping those ideas. Are now kind of 2 programs. One is about labeling food, so creating food products like that you would buy in a grocery store, like a manufactured cereal or granola bars, things like that, that are using plant-based proteins in them instead of the animal-based proteins. And then the other one is around trying to get more plant-based options in school lunches. So that in and of itself is like, you could start a whole organization just doing that, but just trying to get more children in the US who are not used to seeing a vegetarian meal as a full and complete meal, and their parents who are not used to seeing that, for them to see that as a meal, and for them to have options to try that as part of their school lunch, so that the automatic school lunch is not a factory farmed meat product. And then the kind of the coalition is like retailer. We have retailers. We were working with Target, General Mills, Hershey's, Nestle. We're working with smaller groups like Impossible Foods, working with the Humane Society. So it's kind of a coalition of businesses and other organizations that just want to work on this problem together and go through this process and make sure that the money that they're spending on kind of corporate social responsibility and sustainability is having a systems-wide long-term impact. So I will skip the systems change stuff. And the other project that I worked on when I just started is a project called Retail Horizons. And this was a project we did for the Retail Industry Leaders Association. So they're the trade group of American retailers. So pretty much any big American retailer you can think of, Nike, Target, Gap, Limited Brands, which does like Victoria's Secret, all of those retailers are part of RELA. And RELA represents their views in Congress and kind of like lobbies on their behalf to make sure that the American retail industry is strong and that they're being supported. And what's interesting also is pretty much all the members of RELA are hurting right now. So if you follow the news, you know that retail in America is like tanking. They all have like a lot of fixed assets of big box stores. They have a lot of like inventory. So if you're Target and you have all these massive stores, and the trends towards the future are like urbanization, millennials not wanting to own things, and you know, like smaller families, then you're not really in a good place. It's like not what you want. Oh, and of course, online shopping and people thinking like, well, why would I shop at Target when I can like buy glasses from Warby Parker and I can buy Allbirds shoes, and like I can do, you know, go that route than go to like a store like that. So we created some scenarios. So we did a lot of trends research, a lot of work with the companies themselves, and then ended up creating this whole toolkit And you can check that toolkit out. It's free. It's on our website. And we created this whole toolkit for them to kind of think about the future of retail and to test how their business would operate within these different operating contexts. So these are just very short descriptions, but the variables that are here, it's expensive energy versus cheap energy, and then sort of a greater reliance on self and community versus a greater reliance on business and brands. So like, are people more into their community and their self to create and do something, or how they get knowledge about something, or are they looking more towards business and brands to do that for them? So how would their business operate, and then would their business survive, basically were the questions within these contexts. And also if they were supposed to design products for these different scenarios. So part of the toolkit was they had to think about, you know, like a classic product would be like jeans. Like if you were like Levi's jeans, what would your jeans be looking like, and how would you design them, and what would your revenue streams be in each of these 4 scenarios? And so we presented that kind of at their big conference, and did sort of like design iteration from that, as well as kind of looking at their business model in general and whether or not that needed to change. And this is kind of like what it looks like pulled out a little. So one of them is about this one, which they did not like, was considered a bad scenario. The combined effects of geopolitical tensions and resource constraints have made fuel, water, and food more expensive. This leads to a decade of turmoil and stagnation in the US as people struggle to adjust. Net incomes have declined, but there has been a resurgence of local manufacturing and agriculture in the US, and that has provided employment for a more stable and resilient middle class. So obviously not business as usual, but not terrible. You know, it is more of a like individuals growing their own food, people kind of repairing and mending their stuff, and focused very much on their like immediate community and their like local surroundings versus big international brands. So for the brands, not good, given their current positioning. But also worth then thinking about and seeing if they can build in contingencies to what if this future were to come about, how would they continue to add value to their customers. And then now I think I am at time.
Thank you so much.
Sure, thanks.